Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. And we are working through Amos, the book of Amos. This is week 4, and we're going to be talking about meeting God, or a theophany, when God appears. This is part of a continuing series that is looking through all of the book of Amos with the theme, Let Justice Roll. In the first section of Amos, chapter 4, which is what we'll be covering in week 4, we're going to look at some interesting corruption as it deals with how we treat the poor and how we worship. Let's look at the first verse. Amos 4:1. Listen to this message, you cows of Bashan, who are on the hill of Samaria, women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to their husbands, bring us something to drink. Now, just to get our bearings sort of straight here, bringing up this map that you've probably seen a couple times if you watched previous videos. Bashan is right above the Sea of Galilee in the upper left on the map between Aram and Gilead, and Bashan was pasture land, really good, well-fed pasture land, and good cows came from there. And then Samaria is pretty much almost smack dab in the middle of the map, right next to where I have it labeled the nation of Israel. Samaria was the capital city for the northern kingdom of Israel. So basically what Amos is saying here is the land of the east of the Jordan is known for its pasture lands, well-fed cattle. This would create an image of women who were wealthy, healthy, and well taken care of. And one of the commentators, Briscoe, calls them the country club ladies of Israel. So he's using this image of well-fed cows from the prime pasture land in the northern kingdom of Israel. But these ladies exist in Samaria, in the capital city, in the hub of political and social power. So these are the women of the most powerful people, and they're well-fed, well taken care of. They are pampered in certain ways. So the country club ladies of Israel. And we see in that verse, well, let's just look at this idea. Given the cultural context of a patriarchal society, how did these women oppress the poor? The verse says that the women oppress the poor and crush the needy. And then it goes into this idea of who say to their husbands, bring us something to drink. Now, since women weren't able to own property, since women had no real cultural currency, they were probably, what Amos is probably hinting at here is they were pressuring their husbands to provide a affluent lifestyle for them. And that pressure, no matter how it happened, was causing their husbands to oppress the poor. So the women wanted more. They wanted nice things. They wanted wealth. They wanted comfort. They wanted this lifestyle. And to get it, they would beg their husbands for drink, for comfort, for wine, for stuff. And in order to please their wives, their husbands would go out and attain that by any means necessary. What would some modern examples of oppressing the poor indirectly? So the women really had no direct contact with the poor. They had no power or charge over the poor. But to provide for their lifestyle, they manipulated the men in their lives to oppress the poor in order for them to have what they wanted, what they needed. What would be some modern examples of oppressing the poor indirectly? And we have tons of these. We would have, purchasing from companies that use sweatshops. We would have, allowing politicians to provide for us and not for everyone. Maybe being, earning money through the stock market from companies that do terrible loan practices, to get really real. Even though you have no direct contact with them, internet pornography might be providing a market for men who traffic women in the sex trade. Those sorts of things are indirect ways we can oppress the poor, ways we don't really have direct contact with the downtrodden, the needy, the poor, but we are intimately involved with those who are oppressing the poor for our benefit. It's kind of a sobering thought. And let's turn to the next verses and see how God engages this idea. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, look, the days are coming when you will be taken away with hooks. Every last one of you with fish hooks. You will go through the breaches in the wall, each woman straight ahead, and you will be driven along toward Harmon. This is the Lord's declaration. So the Lord swears an oath in the beginning and the end of these two verses, and it shows how seriously God takes the oppression of the poor, even if it is indirect. And the imagery of being dragged straight out of the city with fish hooks communicates that the city will be leveled, the walls will be destroyed, whatever was protecting this opulent lifestyle will be no more. And the idea of hooks, these fish hooks, these things, is kind of communicating this inescapability of the process. So God will judge these women and judge them harshly, even though they weren't in direct contact with the poor. They were just pressuring their husbands to do so as well. And for those of us who might have more of an indirect oppression sort of dealing with stuff, what we do actually leads to that, but we don't actively do it ourselves. This passage might be a very sobering passage for us. Now let's finish up this section with Amos 4 through 5 and see how he kind of puts this all together and connects it to worship. Come to Bethel and rebel. Rebel even more at Gilgal. Bring your sacrifices every morning, your tents every 3 days. Offer leavened bread as a thank offering and loudly proclaim your free will offerings, for that is what you Israelites love to do. This is the Lord's declaration. Now, some notes there. That first line could be translated, come to Bethel, which is the site of the worship, the shrine to what they thought was proper worship of Yahweh. And it could be sin, it could be rebel. Rebelling against God is the ultimate sin in the Old Testament. So that is kind of not very much of a stickler difference between rebel and sin. Come to church and sin is basically what Amos is saying, or come to the sanctuary and sin, come to the altar and sin. Amos is using some strong irony here. He tells them to come to the religious sites, and instead of worshiping God, they should rebel or sin against him. Can you imagine if your worship was thought of by God as just more rebellion? And that passage, those verses, as it talks about the every 3 years, the tithing, the free will offerings, and all that kind of stuff, everything it describes in that passage is in accordance to what is described in Deuteronomy. So technically, they are doing things as they should. The Israelites seem to be worshiping regularly and even tithing, but this worship, even though it is done the right way, is seen as rebellion or seen as sin toward the God that they thought they were worshiping. And even more ironically is this rebellion, the Israelites are proud and boastful of how well they worship God in this rebellious way. So, questions. If they were doing everything right, why was their worship not being accepted? Some of that can go back to the previous verses of how they were still oppressing the poor. And I can't imagine Amos is not drawing the conclusion that they're giving tithes over these riches that they've gotten through oppression. I mean, it would be like, a church bragging and offering money that they got from slave masters to God. That would be what we see here. I honestly think the Israelites thought they were doing everything right. Even while they were oppressing the poor, they were still proud of their worship. They wouldn't have been proud of their worship if they didn't think their worship was effective and meaningful in a way to connect to God. More a rhetorical question here, but have you ever wondered if you are doing things all wrong? Have you ever sat in a worship service and wondered, is our heart really in this, or are we worshiping the worship? Are we worshiping the church more than the God behind everything that's going on? Is how we go about our lives through sin and oppression and just being a little too uncompassionate in our lives really affects whether or not our worship would be acceptable to God. Things to think about, that not necessarily a question to answer, but if you want to drop down in the chat and talk with me about that, I would definitely be paying attention to it. As always, there are 2 ways to join: live Monday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time via Zoom, to have these conversations at least face-to-face, maybe not in person, but virtually face-to-face, and these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. I am all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. Those links will be in the description below. Enjoyed having this conversation with you, and hopefully it will continue soon.